Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to the BSHS Digital Festival 2023. My name is Sam Robinson. I'm the conference chair of the BSHS, and it's my pleasure to introduce you to our afternoon session, Curating Crises, Hidden Histories and New Audiences in Caribbean Volcanology. And I am going to very momentarily hand over to the Royal Society, or Martin, who is at the Royal Society, should I say. Martin, over to you.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us for this session on Curating Crises, Hidden Histories and New Audiences in Caribbean Volcanology. My name's Martin Mahony. I'm a geographer and historian of science at the University of East Anglia, and I'm delighted to be joined this afternoon by some of our wonderful Curating Crises team, who I will introduce you to very soon. What we want to do in this session is talk about a research project that we've been doing on the hidden histories of volcano science in the Caribbean. We want to talk about the intersections of history of science and contemporary scientific practices. And we want to open up some discussion about the role that new modes of communication can play in bringing some of those histories to new audiences and to new knowledge holders. So just by way as a little bit of background, the Curating Crises research project, out of which a lot of this has sprung, is funded by the UK Research Council's part of their Hidden Histories programme. And it's seeking to unearth histories of volcano science in the Anglophone Eastern Caribbean over the course of the 20th century. We're particularly interested in things like volcanic expeditions that were sent to the region from the UK, many of them coordinated from this very building. We're coming to you live from the Royal Society, I should have said, and I'll explain a little bit more why we're here in a moment. And the other main element of the project that we're really keen to develop and that we've been spending a lot of time thinking about is the contributions of local people and local communities in the Caribbean to the advancement of volcano science and disaster risk management. So that's Curating Crises. What you see behind me here is our exhibit, which we've set up as part of the Royal Society's Summer Science Festival, which opens at Carlton House Terrace in London in just a few hours' time. Our exhibit is called Sensing Volcanoes, and my colleague Bridie here will be giving you a whistle-stop tour of the exhibit in a few minutes' time. Broadly speaking, it combines some of this historical research we've been doing with cutting-edge volcanology, which seeks to tell a story about how practices of sensing volcanoes have changed over time, and which seeks to open up some questions around how scientists, decision makers, and publics deal with the challenge of uncertainty. So over the next 45, 50 minutes or so, we're going to discuss some of these intersections and stories. We're going to offer you a tour and an insight of this exhibit and an insight into some of our online resources which we've been developing. And we're going to share some of the work that project partners in the Caribbean have been doing to bring some of this work to new audiences. The intention is that after all that, there'll be plenty of time for questions, comments, feedback from the audience. So we're really looking forward to hearing what you think about this work that we've been doing and how we could sort of expand on it and take it further. But first up, though, I thought it'd be interesting to maybe start by thinking about this relationship between history of science and volcanology as a scientific discipline. So I'm delighted to welcome to the stage one of my co-investigators on the Curating Crises project, Professor David Pyle, who's a professor of volcanology at the University of Oxford and is someone who has had a long-standing interest in the history of the science of volcanology as well as its sort of cultural entanglements. At the same time as sort of doing lots of cutting-edge volcano science as well. So a question for David, which I thought might be interesting for an audience such as this one, is when did you start getting academically interested in the history of your discipline, and what drove that interest?
So I think it was probably in the late 1990s. Originally I trained as a geologist, and then I did a PhD on some of the ancient volcanic rocks on the island of Santorini. So these are rocks that are hundreds of thousands of years old, the products of large explosive eruptions. And then in the mid-1990s, 1995, Montserrat became active. And in 1998, I had the opportunity to join the Montserrat Volcano Observatory as a staff scientist on a rotation. And that coincided with a period of research leave that I had. And by that stage, I discovered that there was a Commonwealth library within the University Library in Cambridge, where I was based at the time. And so that was certainly the first place where I realized that there was a wealth of documentary material relating to volcanic eruptions in the Caribbean during the 19th, 20th centuries, which I simply had been unaware of. And as I read, it was clear that few volcanologists had taken any interest at all in these sorts of sources. I suppose within the field of volcanology, there's always an interest in developing new instruments so we can measure things we weren't previously able to measure. There's always an interest in looking for the next deposit that's not been studied before. But it was actually relatively rare for people to step back and say, well, what else can we find that's linked? But somehow the opportunity to go to Montserrat meant that I was able to visit archives on both Barbados and St. Vincent on the way. I become interested in a very large eruption in 1902 from St. Vincent. And I think my initial interests were that actually you could find in there accounts from a variety of different sources, but which would allow you to verify observations such as where did the volcanic ash land, how much of it was deposited in different places. And these are all pieces of data that, as a volcanologist, you realize have interest. But then, of course, reading deeper, you realize that there's the very same volumes of correspondence in the parliamentary and colonial records. They tell you about the impact of the event on the people who are living there. They tell you about the processes of both of relief, of evacuation, rebuilding, and then recovery.
So archives are a treasure trove of information for the volcanologist trying to understand past eruptions. You mentioned that development of new instruments, new practices of sensing and observation. What's the value of attending very closely to the instrumentation, the sensing practices of past volcanologists, practices that might be now deemed a bit kind of passé, but nonetheless, I mean, these are things that we've been getting quite interested in as part of the project. What can we kind of learn from those past practices that might inform what you do as a sort of volcano scientist in the present?
So I think I'm quite struck. Over the last 20 years, we've seen, for example, lots of technological developments in our capacity to make field measurements, for example, of volcanic gases. And in the 1960s, there were very large spectrometers that needed very large power sources. And then we moved into the 1990s and people have made the instruments smaller. And then there's a step change in the technology. Now there are instruments that you can just carry around. But the interest in terms of looking back is actually enriches your understanding of where we are now and realize that people have actually been trying to solve similar problems, but maybe approaching it from different directions in the past. And this has happened repeatedly. And actually we can learn something about not only we can learn something more about the intellectual development of the subject as an area of research. But also I think there is a tendency in physical science to be driven forward by this, by the shiny opportunities of the future, and thereby to leave behind as unimportant or something that's happened the historical materials. But actually, in volcanology, one of the things that one of our starting points in terms of understanding volcanoes is they're very typically the next time they erupt, it's likely to be quite similar to the previous eruption, particularly for eruptions of the sort that we're interested in, which might happen every few decades at a particular volcano. So there's certainly things that we can learn by going back to look at what people tried to do in response to a previous crisis, what was successful and what was not successful.
And volcanology is a quite unique science in that regard, in that a lot of folks that come into the science might well spend time working in a volcanic observatory and perhaps work through moments of crisis where they're under enormous amounts of pressure to sort of give answers about what a volcano is going to do, should evacuations be set in train, and so on. So from that perspective of sort of disaster management, what do you think either practicing scientists or disaster managers can learn from the kind of archival records that we're going to hear a little bit more about in a few minutes?
So I suppose I'll just give a couple of examples from a project that we were involved in that was led by Jenny Barclay called Strengthening Resilience in Volcanic Areas. And this is a project that kind of kicked off the last 10 years of work that we've been doing in collaboration in the Caribbean. And there were two workshops we had at the beginning. The first workshop was on the island of Montserrat. So it had begun erupting in 1995. It had had a small episode of eruption, or quite a dramatic episode of eruption in 2010. And I think our project workshop was probably around 2012, 2013. And we had a community workshop. And the idea was that we'd bring everyone together to share their stories of significant moments during the eruption, or just moments during the eruption. And as a physical scientist, I remember very clearly that it was really striking that I knew the chronology of the time when it had a very significant eruption, the time when there'd been a dramatic landslide or a catastrophic phase of the eruption. But actually none of those moments registered within the community who were there as events that were significant to them in terms of, obviously, I mean, there were a couple of events which were very significant because they'd caused fatalities, but most of the time that the volcano had been erupting after about 1997, the volcano had been evacuated. So the people living around the volcano at Montserrat couldn't see it, and the main impacts they were dealing with were long-lived episodes of ash emission from the volcano. So it was really interesting to realize that there are multiple narratives around exactly the same event, and actually triangulating between those, sharing with each community sharing their own parts of that story. You then remove power imbalances from there aren't scientists coming and saying this is what happened. Actually, you're set by giving everyone an opportunity to say what their experiences were. You can then end up with a more rounded understanding of what was happening physically, but also what the consequences were of the different styles of activity.
Yeah, that segues rather nicely, I think, into some of the themes we want to pick up, and which we have picked up in our exhibit here. So I'm going to invite my colleague, Dr. Bridie Davies, from the University of East Anglia, to give you a whistle-stop tour of the Sensing Volcanoes exhibit, as well as our online exhibition and archive that we're in the process of constructing. So, Bridie, over to you.
Okay, so I'm going to quickly talk you through Sensing Volcanoes, our exhibit here at the Royal Society. As you can tell by the name, it's all about the different ways in which one might sense changes or things happening at a volcano. So we have different zones in our exhibit. We have a zone over here, which is kind of focused on sound. So we've got an example here of an old listening device that was used by a volcanologist called Frank Perrott in the 1930s. It looked like a large trumpet. He would put it to the ground and he would put his ear to the trumpet and listen to the sounds that the volcano was making. So we have a speaker inside here and we have been playing through sounds that you might hear around a volcano. At the moment, I think we've got sounds from an old faithful geyser in the US playing, and I don't know if you can hear. You might have been able to hear that through the trumpet. So this is a very early way to kind of amplify the vibrations and the sounds that were coming from these phenomena so that we could better detect them ourselves at the surface. So in addition to that, people who visit the exhibit can actually listen to some of those stories and the voices of people on Montserrat talking about what David was talking about, the persistent ashfall that really impacted their lives during the eruption. You can take a look and listen to our ash-covered objects here. So we have a telephone, through which you can hear interviews that were carried out on Montserrat about the ash. And you can also hear some of the cultural responses to the eruption in the form of calypso music by listening to our ash-covered radio here. And this just gives a sense not only of the kind of physical impacts in the kind of visual representation of coming home and finding objects covered in ash, but also how that impacted people over time on Montserrat. In addition to sound, we also have a very special volcano scent that we've crafted with some scent experts at Omeka. And they have produced something that combines the kind of tropical sense of an island volcano with some of the more kind of volcanological sense that we would detect near an erupting or an active volcano. So things that are a bit sulfurous, damp vegetation, as well as the kind of salty sea air that you would expect to have if you're quite close to the coast. So visitors are going to be able to get a chance to kind of really immerse themselves in the kind of sense memory that people would have from eruptions. And when we think about the stories that people tell about being in volcanic environments, the smell of sulfur is one of those really key memories. And it's something that our colleagues at the Seismic Research Centre, based out of the University of the West Indies, spend a lot of their time talking to people about, because when they can smell a change in H2S or sulfurous smells around where they're living, it really raises the alarm for people. They think, okay, I know that this is to do with the volcano. I'm really sensitive to this. And it's something that actually their kind of outreach and engagement team spends a lot of time talking to people about, because it's not just sulfur means a volcano is going to erupt, but it could be to do with changes in wind direction and various other things. So we're really hoping people can kind of start to grasp that humans are actually very good at detecting changes at volcanoes. And indeed, the human nose is more sensitive to the changes in concentrations of gas than even some of our more sophisticated satellite-based instrumentation. So as well as smelling and hearing things, people can actually come and see some of the changes that might happen around volcanoes. So what we have, our main kind of exciting part of the exhibit that people will be drawn to is our Imaginarium. And we can take a look at the lights, the floor of lights here. If we just change, that's it. You can see there's lots of different colors. The different colors represent different batches of magma that would have existed beneath the Le Soufrière volcano in St. Vincent during the 2020 to 21 eruption. The magma chamber system that we have designed here, and the earthquakes that are represented by flashing lights, the various movement of water and carbon dioxide that we've animated into our design, are all based off of the real data that was collected during the eruption by our colleagues at the Seismic Research Centre, and from observations that people made at the surface, so using gas monitoring equipment, and also a lot of the photos that people were taking as they were visually seeing things happen, so especially during the explosive phase, have fed into our reconstruction of what actually happened. So this is an example of where different data streams, different sources, different observers can all feed in to help us really kind of understand what's going on. And the point of the Imaginarium, as we call it, is to help people make those connections between what they can detect at the surface, what can they smell, hear, see, and feel, and what we as scientists always have a very clear picture of in our minds, which is the subsurface. And so by having a visual representation of all of this data that's quite complex and fairly dense to kind of get your head around, people can start to make these links a little bit better. And so we're using the Imaginarium in that way to give this really nice visual representation, and we can actually feed through the different phases of the eruption. So you can see the lights have changed a little bit here, and we can have people listening to the sounds of an eruption if they had an explosive phase later on. We also have a game version, which is where our Imaginarium transforms into a volcanic island. In that time, you would have children, visitors deciding where on the island they would like to live. And then obviously there's a volcano appears and they have to start making decisions about whether they would stay where they are or pay a monetary penalty and move further away from a potential hazard. Obviously, hazards have an effect economically and also in lots of other ways. So if you stay put, you might put yourself at risk from ashfall or from volcanic gases and various other hazards. So in this game, we're trying to get people to think a little bit about how they deal with the uncertainty around a volcanic eruption, what decisions they might make in light of that uncertainty, and also reflect on some of the reasons why people might choose to stay or to leave in that situation. So this is our wonderful Imaginarium. But in addition to that, we've got a little bit of historical data as well. So we've talked a lot about how people have sensed changes at volcanoes, but we also have a kind of historical timeline of how instrumentation has changed throughout the last 150 years, going from very rudimentary seismometers, which we've actually reconstructed one over in our exhibit, through to kind of satellite-based observations that are becoming much more common. But with that in mind, we also have to remember that people have been making these observations themselves and that they've all been very valuable sources of information for a long time. And so that kind of brings us a little bit nicely through to the Curating Crises segment of our exhibit, which links through to our online database that we've been creating. So I'm just going to pop round to the other side here, and hopefully the camera will follow. So our final part of the exhibit is the Curating Crises panel. And you can see that we've divided it here into the two main islands that we focused on for this part of the project. We have Montserrat and St. Vincent. And as we've been working through the archives, we've been picking out stories of people making these types of observations. We've got scientists who were maybe existing slightly outside of the scientific establishment, such as Frank Perrott, who was from the United States, based out of the Carnegie Institute in Washington. He was one of these observers who was very, very, very good at using all of his senses. So we had his trumpet over there as well. He was forever trying to find different ways to record changing gas compositions and concentrations after a few slightly unfortunate incidents where he'd actually exposed himself too much to some of the noxious gases. And we're not really sure that he was able to actually smell the sulfurous gases anymore because he's kind of damaged his respiratory system a little bit through that. So people can learn about the story of Frank Perrott and how he navigated his work as an observer, very much embedded in the communities in which he was serving, versus the other kind of institutional characters who were around at the time. So we've got stories about the Royal Society expeditions, which actually did go to St. Vincent and Montserrat in 1902 and in the 1930s. But there's often a case in these stories that there's a little bit of tension between what the people on the islands need or have observed or have asked for versus what the kind of official establishment can arrange to provide in a timely manner. And so there was lots of discussions amongst various actors at this time about what was a trustworthy source of information, what were they going to do about it, and eventually they did send people to come and record and make observations. As well as the kind of scientists in this story, we have some wonderful stories of local observers who have previously gone uncredited. So we have an example of a group of fish sellers on St. Vincent who made some really crucial observations in 1902 as they were walking over the volcano from Chateau Belair to Georgetown to sell fish. They passed over the crater and made clear observations that there was something happening. They had bubbling, boiling crater, rocks coming out from beneath the lake. They said they could smell the gases and they knew that that meant something was happening at the volcano. They tried to warn people, but being kind of from a lower class and being Black women, they were not particularly viewed as trustworthy observers by the colonial establishment at the time, and some were even threatened with arrest for trying to cause trouble. So these observations that they made were incorporated into official reports by Anderson and Flett, who visited the island after the eruption in a Royal Society expedition. They made very, very careful, detailed notes about the stories that these women had told and the observations they had made. They wrote their names down in their field notebooks, but those names never made it to the official reports. And so the work that the Curating Crises project has been doing has been going back to those original notebooks, finding those names and giving names to those women and allowing them to be properly acknowledged. So one such example is Mary Ann Robertson, who is recorded as both Robertson and Robinson in the notebooks, but people from St. Vincent who we had talked to about this had assured us that from their knowledge of the way that the family names were distributed across the island at that time, that it is indeed Mary Ann Robertson. And that's just another example of how returning this information from the archives, which has been kept locked away in libraries and in institutions in the UK, the US, by returning that information to these communities, they can actually help us make even better observations and bring light to these stories. So all of these bits of archive information are available now on the Curating Crises website. You can see the original documents, as well as see some of our more curated exhibits that we've produced, partly for the Royal Society event, but also for the future. You can go there and you can start to explore these little stories and also the documents themselves. And we're hoping that people from all over the world will start to engage with this material, and then they'll find even more interesting things than we've already started to discover. So in addition to celebrating the stuff from the archives that's previously gone kind of unacknowledged, we've been using the Royal Society event as a way to celebrate some of the wider work of Curating Crises. And that includes this wonderful project that they've been doing in Montserrat, creating a series of community murals. So our colleague, Karen Pascal, who is unfortunately not here because she's currently doing more work for the Curating Crises project in Martinique, has been working with Thiffanie Williams, who's the Outreach and Engagement Officer for the Montserrat Volcano Observatory, together with people from the Education Department and teachers at the high school and community leaders in different parts of the island to create these beautiful cultural murals that celebrate the history that Montserratians have with the island, its biodiversity, and of course the volcano. And so 4 murals have been created, one of which was fully designed by the school children who were attending the after school club that was put on as part of the Curating Crises project. And they also helped to paint the murals and plan everything out. So this is a real kind of community rooted effort. And it's been a really wonderful way for people to share stories and examine the history that they have with the island. So I would encourage you to visit the Curating Crises website. You can find out about the murals and see them in all their glory in the Sensing Volcanoes online exhibit, but also get more detail in a dedicated online exhibit to the murals, because it's a really, really fantastic and visually stunning effort that they've put together. As well as the murals, there's been a wonderful collaboration on St. Vincent with the Changing Landscapes project, where they've made a series of short films that relate the experiences and observations and the cultural significance for people living in the red zone, which is the highest hazard zone on St. Vincent, during the 2020 to 21 eruption of La Soufrière. There are 3 films that go together as a collection. They talk about the process of evacuation, what it was like to return after the eruption was over, and also a little bit of an exploration of the significance of things like cassava bread to their community. And these films are a really wonderful way of showing how that community has come together through the course of this eruption and kind of exploring their own feelings towards the place in which they live during that time. So I think I will hand back over now.
Thank you so much, Bridie, for that excellent whistle-stop tour of all the work that's been going on in and around the Curating Crises project. As Bridie mentioned, one of the big aims of this project is to unearth these hidden stories, which involves going into archives and finding materials that might not have been known about or which may not have been accessible to as many people as they might be. So one of the things we've been trying to do is to work through a digitization process to try and make some of these records, particularly in sort of metropolitan archives in the UK, available and accessible to folks in the Caribbean. So we've been working closely with the archivists here at the Royal Society, as well as the National Archives, on a digitization process. So I'm delighted to welcome from our archive partners, Liz Haines and Kumlertsakul from the National Archives and Louisane Ferlier from the Royal Society. So I'll invite everyone to come on up, and I asked these guys just to reflect for a few minutes on their own sort of institutional approaches to digitization and to sort of accessibility using new digital tools that we have at our disposal. And they've also brought some wonderful examples of some of the sort of volcanic geoheritage that they have in their collections to talk a little bit about as well. So it looks like, Liz, you're primed to go first.
No, I was just thinking that maybe since we've got this lovely here on display, maybe Louise. Yeah, well, Pad is actually going to. So yeah, Pad and I are talking from the National Archives. Pad was going to.
Thank you. My name is Padej Kumlertsakul, and I'm record advisors at the National Archive. And the National Archive is the repository of the records that are produced in the course of the business of the central government departments. And we play a crucial role in preserving the historical records and ensuring their accessibility to the future generations. We hold many important documents created by the central government departments and other public bodies. And these records were vital parts of the country's collective memories and help us to understand the past, present, and potential futures of the countries. So what we do in short is we select, preserve, and make accessible the record of central government. But however, not all the public records are sent to us. Many of these are held by their own institutions. For example, the records of the created by the Natural History Museums. These are held by the Natural History Museum themselves. This means that we are not repositories that hold other type of records, such as the personal records, like a personal diary. We also do not have collections of oral histories. As for the records that we have contributed to the projects, we are mainly coming from correspondence sent to the colonial office about the colonies in Caribbean during the period when they were under British administration. And this series relating to the administrations of individual colonies and colonies contain reports made by scientists who, according to imperial ideology, were engaged in extracting scientific information and specimens from colonies. For example, the documents that we contribute to the project is original correspondence for the Barbados and original correspondence for the Windward Islands. The example here is a physical copy of the. Sorry. Yeah. So this is an unusual form of digital. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry. Right. So sorry. Right. The first example here is the physical copies of the letters from the correspondence series relating to the Barbados in record series CO28. It is the first page of the letters from the governors of Barbados, Sir George Beckwith, to the colonial authorities in London. From the 9th of May 1812, he recounts the perspective from Barbados of volcanic explosions on St. Vincent, where he first had sight of while he eating dinner near the bridge towns on the 30th of April 1812. And another record series that we contribute to the projects are the correspondence and paper of Kew Observatory. And this record series reflects the works of Kew Observatory under the various officers in charge of the observatories. And these include Sir Edward Sabine, the former president of Royal Societies and the leading members of the Magnetic Crusade, who instigated the effort to establish a system of magnetic observatories around the world. It also includes Francis John Welsh Whipple, who played a significant role in recording of the earthquakes, since Kew has been the site of seismological observatories since 1898. And the last but not least, for the record that we contribute to the projects, is the record of the Permanent Joint Headquarters, or PJHQ. This headquarters deliver Ministry of Defense operational capabilities across the world, which include the humanitarian aid. And in response to the extreme explosive event that took place on Montserrat in 1997, the MOD, together with the help from the Americas, engaged in the contingency plan to aid the Montserrat volcanic explosions crisis and the voluntary evacuations of the British territory of the Montserrat. This example is you've seen here is a planning directive of the PJHQ relating to the Operation Bell. This is the peacetime military operations which provide support to the governor of Montserrat to relocations and evacuation of populations of the Montserrat. Thank you. I will pass on to my colleague.
Yeah, thank you so much, Pad.
Thanks, Pad. So of the records that were digitized, as you want to, I can hold them. Of the records that were digitized as part of the Curating Crises project, not many of these fell under the umbrella of records that were already digitized. So they were sort of paid for and kind of digitized through the process of this research project. And I think in order to kind of contextualize that, I need to kind of explain a little bit more about the processes of digitization. So at the National Archives, I think it's rather an unusual archive in its scale, first of all. So we have upwards of 10 million items, and an item might be a volume of maybe hundreds of pieces of correspondence, for example. So the number of individual pieces of letters, for example, would be in the order of hundreds of times more than 10 million. And so although we're doing digitization work all the time, that means that quite a small proportion of our records have been digitized, and lots of our digitization that we do is driven by demand. So the records which are of the most immediate interest to the largest kind of proportions of users. So lots of our digitization focuses around family history research. That's obviously a really large part of what we do. But also other kinds of records that are likely to have wide interest. So some of the digitization work that we do on our own behalf includes, for example, the digitization of the Colonial Office Library photographic albums. So that's a really large set of hundreds of, if not thousands of images that were digitized in the early 2000s, early 2010s, which are available on Flickr and Wikimedia Commons. Because of the kind of, those were digitized because of the kind of appeal that images are understood to have and the ways in which they were likely to be kind of shared and used by communities. Records such as Colonial Office correspondence, scientific and kind of military operation records don't usually fall into the kind of category of records which are most likely to be in demand, and hence not many of those records, as kind of seen today, would have been previously digitized. So where we do digitize those kinds of records, it's very often in partnership either with research projects or sometimes with different kinds of digital publishers who then bear the costs of the digitization processes and also enable those resources to be put online in a different kind of way. So some of our digital resources are available directly through our catalogue. If you find the item in our catalogue, you can immediately see and download that item. Others, as I mentioned, are available through Flickr or Wikimedia Commons. But most of our digitized resources are in fact presented and shared through other platforms than our own platform. So that's, I guess, one part of kind of how our organization manages that sort of process. So in that sense, I think one of the things which is really important for us when thinking about digitization is not just the creation of the digital record, but also then where it will live and how people will access it. And I think that's probably, it's more important perhaps than the actual process of digitization, because if it doesn't have a home and if it isn't going to reach people, then in a way there's no point in going through those costs in the first place. And that's something which I think sounds simple. And again, for a platform as loud, a platform and organization as large as ours, you would imagine perhaps that if you put the material online, that's people would know we're a kind of center of gravity, people would know to come to it, but that's not necessarily the case. So I think for us, the opportunity to work on these kinds of projects where digitized records are brought directly, not only put online, but also brought directly into engagement with different audiences, with different communities, really allows us to understand something about what kinds of records people want, how they understand them or read them when they're available digitally, and also what kind of uses or discussions they might be put to, which really helps feed back in our thinking about what access means. Because, yeah, as I say, digitization is one thing, kind of making digital copies of records is all well and good, but access in a kind of wider sense is really something for which you need to understand the communities that you're, or groups that you're bringing digital records to. So this kind of project is really invaluable for us in thinking about how digital records might be taken up and viewed and put into dialogue with other kinds of experiences, other kinds of records and different groups who might use them. So yeah, it's been a really fantastic opportunity.
Thanks so much, Liz. And yeah, Louisane.
Thank you very much. Yeah, actually, I'm going to pick up exactly where you left it, Liz, which is, I have picked one item from our collections, but where I want to get to is exactly the same point, which is, we can digitize at scale, but if we do not have the outreach and the contextualization, because you're named Curating Crises, and the curation that goes into creating the website as you have created it, and explaining what the context of the information that you're looking at is, as well as extracting those names, the work of actually putting the records together and creating the stories. Without those, what we're doing is very different. And I chose the example of one item, which I think is looked at in the wrong way. And I'm hoping that we can look at it together and to discover a different way of digitizing and, again, putting things into context. So please follow me towards the archive, which is presented at the top of the stand. And as I say, I hope it's going to bring us all together and we can have a discussion around it. I hope you can see this quite large illustration from your screen. So what you're looking at is an illustration which was sent to the Royal Society for potential publication within the Royal Society Philosophical Transactions. Because we're talking to the BSHS, I'm talking to a public which will know of the Philosophical Transactions. The first point I would like to make is that outside of historians of science, the Philosophical Transactions is not necessarily a place where people will look for a history of St. Vincent. And this is actually the first description of the crater of St. Vincent, on St. Vincent. But for local in St. Vincent, why would you go to the scientific journal of the Academy of Sciences of the UK to actually find the first depiction? It doesn't actually make that much sense. So that's the first thing to say. This sketch was actually sent by someone who was a botanist and was the gardener of the colonial gardens on St. Vincent, who realized that the mountain that he was looking at looked very much like a volcano. It smelled like a volcano, and it sounded a bit like a volcano too. And he sends this letter, which starts here, describing his ascent. And actually, I'm going to start by the end because it ties in quite nicely with what you were talking about, David, in the first instance. Here is how he ends his paper. I am sorry I had no instrument to take the state of the air, nor the exact dimension of its different parts. And he carries on, but from the situation of these islands to one another, to the continent of South America, I imagine there are submarine communications between the burning mountains or volcanoes in each of them, from them to the volcanoes on the high mountains of America. The islands, which are situated next to the continent, seem to tend in the direction of those mountains. And I have observed that the crater in this island lies nearby in a line with the Soufrière in St. Lucia and Montpellier in Martinique, and I dare say from Montpellier to a place of the same kind in Dominique. So he's actually trying to observe the direction of the volcano and indicating that there is actually a line of volcano. This letter dates from 1784, so we are really early in the understanding of the geology of volcanoes. But why I chose it as well is for actually the very beginning of when he's starting to climb the mountain. He is trying to find the best path, and he just observed the path from the bottom and needs to actually climb it. So he found, I came to Mr. Maloon's about a mile distant from the mountain, but the nearest house to it I could stay all night. Here I met with a friendly reception and great hospitality. After communicating my intention to him, I climbed the volcano, he told me he would give me every assistance he could by sending some trusty Negroes with me, and wish he was able to go with me himself. This was a kind offer to me in my then situation, as Negroes were that what I only wanted, having only one boy belonging to Dr. Young with me. He will go on after climbing the volcano quite successfully to say that he owes his life to this enslaved man. He is planning to climb without water, which obviously for a 2-day expedition in the Caribbean is problematic. And he relies entirely on the enslaved man to actually carry the water back and forth. And also he recognizes their knowledge of the terrain. But why I chose this is that it's not a very famous known piece of archive, one that if we describe in the catalogue, and as Liz was saying, we have on a much smaller scale than the National Archive, but we still have several hundreds of thousands of pieces of item. Our description is a few lines. We will not account for the specifics of the expedition. We will definitely not be able to name the people within those archives. However, putting it in conjunction with potential archives on St. Vincent, on ownership of enslaved people, could potentially actually allow you access to this knowledge. So this is digitized, and this is actually digitized as part of a very large project that we have, but this is one of several hundreds of documents. And as I said, in response to what Liz was saying, without a research project actually unlocking the meaning within the archives, our work goes as far as making it available, accessible. We cannot do the interpretation, and we cannot even, I think, reach the public that needs to see those. And I think this is why your project makes a big difference. So this is all I wanted to say.
That's fabulous. Thanks so much, Louisiane. And yeah, a document which so brilliantly captures so many of the sort of tensions and complexities that we've been grappling with throughout this project. We're coming towards the end of our time here, so I want to throw it out to our audience now for questions to any of us, comments, feedback on what we've been doing. Perhaps if I could invite all our speakers to sort of come and gather round our oil barrel here, which is where we're keeping all the smelly stuff, basically. Let's see if we can access the Q&A part of our little webinar stream here. Apologies, we are slightly winging all this, so thank you for bearing with us. Okay. While folks are thinking about questions, perhaps we could just sort of discuss a little bit more this sort of question around the challenges of digitization and finding new audiences for this material, the audiences that deserve and need to see this material. A lot of archives in this country work quite closely with archives in some of the countries that we've been working in, and you have relationships with those institutions, and they're institutions that perhaps have obvious difference in resources, but also kind of different needs in terms of attracting people to them and ensuring sort of footfall and users of their collections. How does sort of digitization, do you think, sort of play out in contexts like sort of Montserrat and St. Vincent, and what's the role of sort of metropolitan institutions, if you like, in sort of supporting those kinds of archives?
I think as part of the discussions we've had within this project, it was fabulous to actually talk to the librarians in Montserrat in particular, and just hearing how they were perceiving the collections. And the first point that they made was one of just protection, just being able to actually store and preserve the physical archive. Liz has mentioned already that platforms can be problematic, because if it doesn't find its public, then there's no reason for it to be on there. But I would like to bring another question, which is, when we're digitizing, we're created a copy, a surrogate of something that exists, which means that you have to take care of the digital surrogate as well. Putting it out there is one thing, but we are custodians of the digital material as well as custodians of the physical material, which means that imposing on partners in the Caribbean who already are struggling with taking care of the physical material, the onus of taking care of the digital material is problematic as well, because you have to think about the digital storage, as in the number of terabytes they have to pay to actually maintain it, and then you have to have a platform that is also, you know, kept up to speed for it to be worth it. The number of research projects that do not have a long-term data plan can also be problematic. Meaning, you know, a project will take care of a website, and then at the end of the when all of the postdocs move on, then the data goes nowhere and the website is not taken care of. All of those issues, they are the same in the Caribbean, but they have to prioritize where the money goes. And so I think, you know, it's our role as well as partners to say, if we have places to host material, you know, this is, you know, we can do that, because it's never an easy thing to digitize. It is a decision-making process.
Thanks. Yeah, and I guess the other, I mean, with that, thinking about the kind of the geographies of access, and so obviously lots of our records pertain to the UK, lots of our records pertain to places all around the world, and particularly the former British Empire. However, there's interest in access, but also differing abilities to access different kinds of platforms in different places, different kinds of Wi-Fi capabilities, and different ways in which people use digital technologies to kind of access and share information in different places. So again, these I think are things which, as an institution who is thinking about sharing records of the colonial legacy, we're still very much exploring. And again, through this kind of project, that really allows us to get a sense of some of those things with specific groups. But I think also in terms of thinking about the future of those organizations who have their own records in, for example, Montserrat, I think one of the things that it's a kind of complicated balancing act, because we also want to prioritize future investment in their capacity to store and to provide access to the records on their own terms, rather than via a third party. So I think thinking about how projects can not only increase access to specific sets of records in the short term, but also support institutions to enable them to provide access to their own material in the longer term to different users is really important. And that's quite a difficult thing to structure into a project, and obviously has to be done in dialogue with those institutions.
Digitization is much more complicated and much more political than I think I ever sort of imagined before I started sort of engaged in this kind of work. So yeah, thank you very much both for those answers. I should say that we've been joined by Pat Joseph from the University of West Indies, one of our project partners in the region. So if you have questions for Pat, or of course for any of us, do put them in the chat. Perhaps we should talk a little bit more about where we are physically. We're in one of the exhibition rooms for the Summer of Science. We are surrounded by cutting edge science. We're directly opposite the Mars rover, which folks can come and have a play with, which is very cool. But we're here with an old ear trumpet and, you know, a sort of 1930s pendulum and various other bits of, you know, historical bits and bobs. So, I mean, maybe this is a sort of question for Louisane. Obviously, history of science is very important to the Royal Society. And this year in particular, it seems that history of science has a really strong presence in this otherwise very kind of cutting edge, forward looking festival. Would you like to say a little bit about that relationship and how that's sort of working out this year?
Yeah, absolutely. The actual name of the library, we're not a library, we're the Center for the History of Science. So yeah. I'd like to think that we care about the history of science. But this year in particular, as part of Summer Science, we always curate, the collections team always curates an exhibition. And this year, I'm happy to have curated the current one, which actually recreates the equivalent of Summer Science 100 years ago. So we've tried to look at the exhibits that were presented in 1923 and presents some of those as part of, and we're opening as part of Summer Science, but the exhibition will stay on a little bit longer than Summer Science itself. And it was very interesting to actually look at what made it into the 1923 exhibits and what survived No volcanology, I'm afraid, that year. That's a hit or miss sometimes. And a lot of the time, the volcanology is just petrology and just showing a few rocks. And there's very little about, well, there's some presentation of the expeditions when they come back. And after that, it just disappears. And I think you have, as part of your stand, something about parachuting scientists. I really got a sense through looking at the exhibition programs of the past years that you have this. You have when expedition comes back, they do talk about the results of the expedition, and then it drops until the next crisis. Yeah. And then you will have some new material come back.
So I could actually take up on, what you're saying, in that the Seismic Research Center is celebrating its 70th anniversary this year, and we were created based on the colonial response to hazards and particularly geohazards, earthquakes, and volcanic activity in the region. So there was a transition from response from teams coming from the UK, the US, to the region to respond to crises, which would have often happened while things had already started or they were actually finished. And then from that came the need, or the recognition of the need, to have a regional agency present to respond to these crises in a more real-time manner. And over the last 70 years, the Seismic Research Center was the agency that was created to do that. And so in terms of our presence here, of course, we would have responded to volcano seismic crisis in all of the islands, and eruptions certainly in Montserrat, St. Vincent, and it having access to the digital data, as you say, and information in the archives it would help as we move forward in terms of understanding the past and incorporating a lot of the knowledge that is now available into the way in which we try to advance how we communicate, how we monitor, and how we interact with stakeholders. So this is this is important, especially coming out of the most recent eruption from Asufre, where there was quite a lot of I don't want to say attention, but in terms of interest from the region, from the diasporas, not the entire Caribbean diaspora, not just in Vincent, in terms of what was happening and its impact, not on just in Vincent, but neighboring islands, because of course the impact is not limited to one island, based on the winds, etc. Impacts can affect neighboring islands. So.
Thanks, Pat. That's a wonderful point on which to finish. I think it circles back to what David and I were maybe talking about at the beginning, about this relationship between history of science and the practice of science and disaster management in the present. And I think for historians of science who are out there listening, I think this kind of work, shows how history of science really matters, actually, and it can have an impact on how we think about and do things in the present. And that's one of the things we want to kind of realize through this project, is maybe kind of take a look at some of that parachute science that still kind of goes on, and maybe see if we can talk to funders about how actually things could be done differently and in a more kind of equitable way for folks in regions like the Caribbean. We're out of time. I really hope we haven't been looking at the wrong bit of the webinar interface and have missed loads of questions. Apologies if we have. If you do have questions, comments, feedback for us, please get in touch. Through the website, you'll find email addresses. We're sort of, we've got Twitter accounts and all that kind of stuff. There's multiple ways to get in touch. Let me just say thanks to all our wonderful speakers and contributors here. Thank you to the tech team at the British Society for the History of Science, and a big thanks to the tech team here at the Royal Society, who have helped make this a way more professional operation than we were expecting it to be. We were going to be walking around with like a GoPro and a phone, but here we are with multiple cameras and microphones, and I hope that sort of come across really well for you on the stream there. So thanks, Royal Society team, who are above our heads in the control booth, I think, at the moment. The last thing I just want to say is stick around for other bits of the British Society for the History of Science Digital Festival. Join the society as well. If you're a historian of science, or you're working in the field, or just have a kind of interest in science as history, do join the society. It's a wonderful institution, and it will unlock lots of brilliant resources for you. With that, and on that note, I'm going to throw it back to Sam in the control room, and